Welcome to the Arms Control Primer, a podcast by the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I am your host, Alex Bollfrass, the head of strategy, technology, and arms control, based in Berlin. On each episode, we welcome the world's leading experts in arms control to share their knowledge and assessments on the most critical issues. Whether you are new to the topic or need a refresher, please join us in our exploration of the nuclear past, present, and future. In this season, we examine the histories and policies of countries that may have had nuclear weapons ambitions or even nuclear arsenals, and gave them up. We search for lessons for non-proliferation, arms control, and disarmament. I hope it helps you better know a non-nuke.
This is where they started to collaborate with the AQ Khan network. This is the Pakistani scientists that started to sell nuclear technology in an underground network. And Libya was one of its key customers. And as part of that, they provided parts and tried to develop a different route to building nuclear capacity, but again, also not very successfully.
In Libya, do I feel we were 100% sure? No, not at all, because we didn't know that there were more copies of the weapons drawings. We don't know that if Libya was withholding things from us that we'd asked to see. So despite the fact that it felt good and we felt things were consistent, that's not 100% certain.
In December 2003, Libya made the surprise announcement that it would abandon its nuclear and chemical weapons programs and admit inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. It would also eliminate missiles with ranges over 300 kilometers to meet the limits of the missile technology control regime. Dr. Hassan Elbahtimy and Robert Kelley, a former IEA inspector, talked to us about the long history of Libya's nuclear weapons ambitions, the international partnerships they sought in furthering those, how the investigations went after the program was revealed, and what broader lessons can be learned from the Libyan model.
My name is Dr. Hassan Elbahtimy. I'm a senior lecturer in the War Studies Department at King's College London. I work on the global politics of weapons of mass destruction, trying to look into international regimes, but also views and attitudes and positions by countries from the global south and how they relate to the global nuclear architecture and how they address and think through some of the nuclear questions of our age. I'm also interested in some technical elements of nuclear arms control, so I'm very interested in verification, and I've worked at Vertec for a long while before going to King's. It's interesting to think of the broader timeline of Libya's nuclear thinking, and that's to a large extent because of the long timeline. It's a timeline that starts from when Gaddafi assumed power as part of a revolution that deposed an old king, Idris, and that was in 1969, all the way till 2003, when Libya announced that it is going to give up on its small nuclear program, with emphasis on small nuclear program. So that's a timeline from 1969 all the way till 2003. Interestingly, a timeline dominated by one key figure, which is Gaddafi, was president for such a long time. He would not call himself president, initially colonel, which was his rank when the revolution took place, and then leader of a revolution and brother leader, all sorts of terms that take him away from the formal structures of the state and tie him perhaps into a revolutionary project. Understanding Gaddafi is quite key and important in order to understand what happened in Libya and Libya's drive and how it relates to nuclear questions. You can think of an early phase when Gaddafi and members of his revolutionary council coming to power. They were young officers in their 30s assuming power and overthrowing the king, and really driven by Libya being part of a broader political project that is of a regional nature. They were Arab nationalists. They were thinking of their political project as a support, as part of a broader political project in the region for Arab unity, and espouses Arab nationalism. And at the core of it, it's breaking down the borders between countries that were associated with colonialism. And Gaddafi and his officers were very hot on that. They were very convinced and were fully paid members into that political ideology. It was a key motivator for them. As part of that, they came into power in 1969. This was in the aftermath and not entirely unrelated to the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, where Arab armies received a big defeat. They were presenting themselves as a new wave of Arab leaders wanting to pull the Arab nation out of that defeat. As part of that, the thinking about nuclear started to take form. One of the early attempts in 1970 that shows actually also the inexperience of the Libyan leadership at the time, where they approached China, and because China is a developing country seen to have experienced colonialism, so they would identify more easily with it. But in 1970, one of the key leaders in Libya, in a trip to China, asked them whether they can buy a nuclear weapon in China. The Chinese officials politely declined that offer. But that shows you the early experimental, not really very well-focused attempts to dabble with the nuclear question. In the 70s, they tried to support other countries, including, for example, linking up with Egypt to try to explore whether they can either finance or contribute to a nuclear program. They helped Pakistan, contributed to the nuclear program, with the idea, again, of doing a support act to another country developing nuclear potential. None of these projects really bore fruition, except obviously for Pakistan, who received a sum of money from Libya at the time. And you also need to put this into the larger context of the oil boom in the 70s that made Libya a country with cash to think how to spend. In the 80s, there was more of a drive to build internal capacity within the country. Libya is a country with a sparse population. It looks huge on the map, but is scarcely populated. And the scientific and technical institutions, in general state institutions as well, were in their infancy, not as developed. So the 80s were a time where there was a drive to procure and build up nuclear capacity, including collaboration with the Soviet Union to build the first research reactor and the ambition of a power reactor. That didn't lead to significant progress. A research reactor was built, but the power reactor project in this part of the world is also linked to desalination, which is freshwater is a problem that Libya has. Didn't really fly because of various reasons: Soviet skepticism of the value of the collaboration, some Libyan financial troubles, the lack of state capacity in Libya, and the lack of clear focus and dedication to the project. And then gives way to the 90s, and this where they started to collaborate with the AQ Khan network. This is the Pakistani scientists that started to sell nuclear technology in an underground network. And Libya was one of its key customers. And as part of that, they provided parts and tried to develop a different route to building nuclear capacity, but again, also not very successfully. And then the whole story ended in 2003 when Libya announced that it's going to give up its nuclear program, nuclear ambitions, and open its doors to inspectors and also intelligence officials from other countries take away whatever equipment they had at the time as part of a general package to rehabilitate Libya and bring it back to the international community at the time.
I'm Robert Kelley. I'm licensed in the state of California as a nuclear engineer, and I worked on the nuclear weapons programs of the U.S. on the order of 35 years. During that time, I also had assignments at the IAEA, so I know a lot about nuclear weapons design, having built them, supervised building them, and worked on a lot of intelligence issues, primarily on the Soviet Union. I find myself fascinated by the topic. As someone who built nuclear weapons in the past, it's exciting to be involved in trying to get rid of them. When we went to Libya, it was a very disorganized effort, and it wasn't going anywhere. Part of their ambitions were that everybody was milking money out of this nuclear weapons program, that it wasn't at all clear that their heart was in it. The man who ran the nuclear center at Tajura ended up being at the NBSR on the weapons side. NBSR is the National Bureau of Scientific Research. And one of the reasons it wasn't on anybody's radar because it had nothing nuclear in the title. It's a good one because it's one of these cases where we saw in a number of places, the people actually doing the work, the ones you're going to be interested in, don't have nuclear in the title, and so nobody pays attention to them. He got a lot of money, and I talked to him what he used it for. He used it to rebuild the whole water supply and sewage system at Tajura because the place had been built in an area where everything had capped up and you could no longer get water out of the pipes and flush the toilets. And so he did things like that. And then I remember seeing a beautiful electron microscope that they purchased. I remember the company they bought it from in Japan, and they had this beautiful microscope. And we said, what do you plan to use this for? Why did you buy it? Everybody needs a beautiful electron microscope in a research program. How is this going to help the nuclear weapons program? Oh, I don't see how it will. They were very anxious to get their hands on the money, but there wasn't much sign that there was a coordinated effort to make sure they were doing the right thing.
Libya looked to other countries to build up its nuclear program. Hassan Elbahtimy discusses the most important partners, as well as Libya's pathway to joining the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT.
The Soviet Union was a prime supply of technology in the 80s, but then relations deteriorated towards the late 80s. But it's within that context and in response to Soviet pressure that Libya ended up joining the NPT. And ultimately, Soviet Union provided Libya with the research reactor. But then the bigger ambitions for a nuclear power reactor never really materialized. We don't have a full, deep understanding of the internal conversation within Libya. It was an opaque regime for a long period of time. So the ins and outs of how that decision was taken is not clear. But there are some circumstantial evidence or some activities that were taking place at the time that would suggest that Soviet pressure was really important because they started collaborating with the Soviet Union, including through the provision of some nuclear infrastructure. And the Soviet Union was actually quite serious about proliferation. And I would probably hazard to postulate that it's through Soviet pressure that they said, we're going to provide you with this technology, but as part of that, you need to be part of this treaty where you commit not to develop nuclear weapons. It was tied to the supply of technology by the Soviet Union. An important international link and dimension is the relationship with Pakistan, the official program in the 70s, and that includes providing financial support to the Pakistani nuclear program. At the time, this was under Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, the Pakistani prime minister. And then in the 90s, and perhaps building on some of the networks that were already established from the assistance in the 70s, they linked up with A.Q. Khan, a Pakistani scientist that would provide nuclear expertise, nuclear materials that bore fruit.
Robert Kelley talks about the time when the IAEA uncovered that Pakistan had provided Libya with drawings of nuclear weapons designs.
Interesting that Khan sold them all these centrifuges, but he didn't sell them the UF6 they needed, the uranium hexafluoride gas. He didn't give them that, and he didn't give them any capability to make the gas. And so when you stop and look at it, he sold them a bunch of centrifuges for which they had no feed material. And the question is, was he planning down the line to supply them, or was he just trying to get rich off of supplying things that he knew they couldn't use? I always think it's kind of like the person who sells you a cell phone and they give you this beautiful iPhone something or other, but then to make it work, you've got to go and buy some kind of plan or whatever that costs a lot more than the phone did in the first place. That's probably where he was headed. He sold them all this stuff for the Centuries program, but later on he was going to blackmail them for the material they needed to put into it. Because they didn't have any way to make UF6. As far as we can tell, he never sold them the technology, even the ideas. IAEA, all of us there were very appalled when we learned that they had a set of drawings that apparently came from Pakistan and allegedly referred to a Chinese device, which is known as Chick-4. It was a stunning development. We were shocked, appalled, and really concerned that this barrier of not sharing nuclear design information had been breached. I believe that's the first time anything like that has happened as a giveaway or a sale of documents.
Libya gave up its nuclear plans in 2003. Hassan Elbahtimy explains how that decision was made.
You need to go into the politics of 2003. This was a time when Libya was headed by Gaddafi still, who had ruled from 1969 till 2003 at the time when that decision was made. And Libya, like many Arab countries at the time, had big question hanging over the leadership. Leaders are getting older and there are no succession plans, because the politics in these countries were so stifled that no political talent was emerging bottom up. And part of the thinking at the time was that new leadership would emerge, tightly traditionally linked to the families of the rulers. So you see that in Syria, where young Assad becomes president. You see that in Egypt, where Gamal Mubarak is touted as a possible successor. You see in Yemen, in a way, a perversion of all the Republican tradition in these countries by turning them more monarchical. And in Libya, that was the case. Then Gaddafi's son emerged, someone who was educated in Western universities and with interests in joining an international community after long decades of isolation, was being groomed as a possible successor. And with him, the idea of integrating into global economy and bringing Libya out from the cold. The nuclear issue was one of the things that were outstanding in terms of Libya's relations with international community, with Western countries. It was offered as something that would help rehabilitate Libya into international community. The succession question was a key driver, and the way nuclear program played into that is crucial to understand the succession program itself and how the nuclear program ended. It's also fair to say that it was also possible because the nuclear program itself was not hugely successful. So Libya didn't really, at any stage of that long timeline, manage to develop any indigenous, technical, scientific base or institutions that would push this forward. The program didn't really achieve much. Achieved a bit of hardware, but not really anywhere close to a functioning solid program. So in a way, it was also easy to give up because it wasn't really that big or significant. The program, when it was discovered in 2003, it was at least a catalyst in how it was discovered was an interdiction of a shipment that was on its way to Libya that had some centrifuge components. It's important also to highlight that discussions were already underway between Libyan officials and the UK primarily, but then also the US about how to resolve the nuclear issue. So it might have been just a catalyst. It's fair to say that the scale of collaboration between Libya and the AQCon network was not predicted or foreseen before Libya fully opens up after 2003 as part of the deal to give up its nuclear program. So investigators from the UK, from the US, from the IAEA, who later had some access, were surprised by the level of collaboration, by what Libya managed to get from the AQCon network. So that's an aspect of it. There's that element of, oh, well, you could actually procure that many material, that many parts. On the other hand, it also became clear that there are some clear deficiencies in Libya's procurement efforts. Libya's program never really fully used materials and the component at its disposal. Many of it would stay locked in boxes. Many of the design information and stuff were unaccessed. So it's almost like they got the things, but never really put them together or put their minds to work in order to get it done and built up and used. So that's interesting, the scale of what was accessible through the black market, but at the same time, how little it was used. And the contrast is a key part of understanding the outcomes of the investigations that took place at the time about what Libya was up to and doing.
My specific assignment on this was to look at the weapons implications of these drawings that Libya had received. I was part of a team of people who were also looking at the centrifuges. What we learned about the ambitions was how many years you could go back and see that Libya had been, in a very disorganized way, looking at producing nuclear energy, maybe nuclear weapons, thinking about reactors. It was all very disorganized, poorly put together. So while there was money and attention put into it, it was start and stop, changing directions. It looked like they were interested in going the plutonium route, then the uranium route. So this was just the latest effort that they had. I would call it all very unsuccessful, disorganized, and primarily a sink for money and corruption.
Robert Kelley shares his experiences investigating the Libyan program on the ground.
I did a number of inspections of countries that had nuclear ambitions: Iraq, Taiwan, Korea, and of course Libya. And in the process of those inspections, we usually had a lot of help from intelligence agencies. For example, in Iraq, there was open collaboration specified by the UN Security Council. When we went into the Libyan case, nobody came to tell us anything. And so the two of us who were working on the weapons, there was information given to the people looking at centrifuges, but not to the weapons program. So we had to create a program on our own. And one of the things that I tried to do was to look at the entire weapons of mass destruction program of Libya. because there wasn't much on the nuclear. The nuclear didn't go anywhere, but the chemical program was quite advanced. They built large facilities, were making chemical weapons, storing chemical weapons, and as part of that investigation, back in 2004, an awful lot was found and taken care of, and of course their missile program was very significant. Had a lot of Scud missiles they acquired from the Eastern Bloc, and when we were there, we found them making Scuds using North Korean tools and North Korean materials. So the nuclear program was a very logical thing to tie to it. We did go into all of their manufacturing and R&D facilities that looked like they were military, and that was useful, but nuclear specific, there just wasn't anything. Their nuclear research center, for example, wasn't involved in the nuclear weapons program. So that was pretty much a closed door. We looked into that and could see no connection whatsoever. So tying it to the other WMD programs was very important. The important problem with the Libyan inspections versus, say, South Africa or Iraq was we didn't get any intelligence help. There were two of us doing the inspections on weapons, and we did it all on our own with open source information. I don't remember anybody who came to us and said, you need to go here, you need to go there. So part of the process, and you'll see a difference between this and other countries, was we went to the National Bureau of Scientific Research, NBSR, which was the organization in Libya that was running the nuclear weapons program. It wasn't really a nuclear weapons program, the nuclear ambitions program, let's put it that way. And we said to them, we don't have much information. Here's what we need to see and what you need to show us. We want to see all the manufacturing capabilities at this level. We want to see if factories are producing parts for cars because they had foundries and machine tools. We went to any place, we gave them a request, take us to any place that's handling energetic materials. That meaning high explosives or propellants. And they took us a bunch of places, and it was such a complete list that you could feel like they had complied with it. They even took us to a plant that was making liquid fuel for missiles that were coming from Iran. So there were some connections there, and we felt that they had made pretty much a sincere effort to show us things. We're very cognizant of the fact it's a big country, but I don't think we ever got more than 100 kilometers from Tripoli. It seemed like everything that was of interest to us was there. And when we asked about other places, they couldn't come up with anything. And in our own research, we didn't find anything outside the Tripoli area. And that in some cases can be put to the fact that Gaddafi was part of a clan or a tribe of Libyans, and they owned land around Tripoli, and their clan was around Tripoli, so they did things around Tripoli. Google was something at the end of the 20th century, and we were all just learning to use it, for example. And satellite imagery with Google Earth, I don't think got into people's hands until around the time that we were doing that. So we were pretty blind. The CIA had given some images of the nuclear facility at Tajura, and we looked at that, but we came to the conclusion there was nothing going on there with respect to weapons. And then eventually we did see pictures that had been given to our centrifuge team of sites that Libya had declared to the centrifuge team. And we saw some of those images, none of which related to what we were doing. So in real time, we didn't have much data. And I'm being very honest about this, but we're very dependent on the Libyans to show us what it was we needed to see, what we wanted to see, and to their honesty. And I just have to say, in retrospect, it all held together. They didn't answer all our questions, and they were very reluctant to give us documents. I think in those cases, it was because the documents related to things like funding would have shown that the money that was put into the weapons program didn't go into the weapons program. It went into Rolex watches and gold chains. We saw a lot of evidence of that. I have to say it was very successful in proving to us and to the people we talked to that there was no weapons program. We felt good about saying, yes, they had these weapons drawings. They claimed they had never looked at the drawings, and to the best of our ability, we couldn't tell. They claimed they had no electronic copies of the documents. They were paper. And they claimed there were no other paper copies. There's no way to verify those particular things. But when we went to the factories that we asked to go to, we went in particular to the missile facilities, which are very important. There we found some machine tools and things that could have been used in a nuclear program. But from the body language, for example, we observed that the missile people hated the nuclear people. The nuclear people would take us to a place we asked to go, And they'd leave us with the missile people because they didn't get along. You could see they knew each other. And it was pretty clear to us that the missile people considered the nuclear program to just be diverting money from their program. Again, that's something that you get in person on inspections, is body language. And when they invite the person who's taking you around to leave and come back and get you when you're done, you get the impression they didn't get along. I've done a number of inspections in interesting countries, South Africa, Iraq, Libya are main ones that come to mind with nuclear weapons ambitions. And then people say, how can you prove a negative? In the case of Iraq, we felt very good that we had turned over everything that was important. We also felt that there were a few things missing that we hadn't found. We didn't see them as a problem. We went to South Africa. I was the main one in South Africa on weapons. It was very clear to me. We saw facilities, we saw machines, we saw nuclear material that we could verify to the nearest kilogram or even better. We got to interview everybody in the country who we thought was of value, and they pointed us in various directions, and we used our own information. And you know what? I'm 100% certain that we didn't miss anything in South Africa because we had lots of cooperation, lots of data, good data like nuclear material measurements. And so as an engineer, you say, can you be 100% sure? And my answer is, yeah, as a professional person, we did it right. In Libya, do I feel we were 100% sure? No, not at all, because we didn't know that there weren't more copies of the weapons drawings. We don't know that if Libya was withholding things from us that we'd asked to see. So despite the fact that it felt good and we felt things were consistent and all, that's not 100% certainty. South Africa, we walked out saying, there's nothing else to find. And we were able to tell our masters that. In Libya, it was, we didn't find anything, and that seems reasonable based on what we saw.
With its program uncovered in 2003, Libya pledged to accept the IAEA additional protocol, granting the agency more inspection rights. Hassan Elbahtimy discusses the Libyan model in this context.
It's an important dimension because many officials talk about the Libyan model. It's just become something that is talked about a lot in non-proliferation, or at least pushed forward by some policymakers. And the Libyan model is basically providing Libya as a blueprint of how to address some of the nuclear proliferation challenges. So what is the Libyan model? What happened in Libya? Libya was through backdoor, back channel diplomacy, agreed a deal to give up the entirety of its nuclear program. And in return, get a package of inducements, whether relief of sanctions, investments being integrated into world economy. And in a nutshell, that's the essence of the model. I think it's sometimes over-enthusiastically used as an attractive model for other countries, and that's because Libya's nuclear effort and nuclear program itself was largely unsuccessful. Some of the key nuclear challenges we face are programs that are much more developed, much more successful, much more institutionalized. Therefore, carrying it over as a model for other countries can sometimes face that discrepancy in terms of the scale of the program and how successful it is. But I think it's also has become tied into all sorts of frustrations. The Libyans were clearly frustrated after they came out and got rid of their nuclear program. Gaddafi and others from the Libyan regime were on the record saying they are dissatisfied with the deal that they have struck, that they thought they would be more integrated, more quickly integrated, would get more benefits from giving up their nuclear programs. After that, any illusion that a deal like that can give some form of regime security has become also tenuous given what happened in Libya, which I think also demonstrates what little leverage some countries might have, because what happened in Libya in 2011 is a mass popular revolt against Gaddafi. And ultimately, NATO intervened with airstrikes that helped accelerate the process of the fall of Gaddafi's regime. But ultimately, those who would say we can give regime security for giving up nuclear program now have a problem to market that or make it appealing given what happened to Gaddafi. And if anything, that also shows the limitation of providing some regime security, specifically when there is popular discontent. So Gaddafi ended up dying a brutal death, and giving up the nuclear program didn't help him stay in power.
Our guests share their takeaways and lessons learned from this curious case.
Certainly, It would be good for non-proliferation if everyone could share what they knew. When we went to Libya, we were pretty much on our own. The other lesson learned is for people to learn the lesson. We went there. We found that there was no nuclear weapons program. We documented that they had a bunch of drawings. We documented that they hadn't done anything with the drawings as far as we could tell. We, to the extent of visiting facilities around the country, didn't see any sign that the weapons program had been done. And then you read people writing papers afterwards. People say, if Gaddafi hadn't given up his nuclear weapons program, he'd still be alive today. Well, he didn't have a nuclear weapons program. So, what's the point? And they keep trying to compare this with Kim Jong-un and DPRK and saying, this is the reason he's not giving up his program.
We should be more careful in distinguishing hardware, materials, components, infrastructure, and a functioning nuclear program. Because Libya at various points managed to get bits and pieces of this and that, but never really managed to put it together in a way that constitutes a thriving, successful nuclear program. So it helps us understanding, calibrating what it means to have some components and how far that can take you. And what the Libyan case shows, that without clear political commitment, without clear, successful, strong institutions that can drive that effort forward, that the output can be quite humble and not very successful. And I want to mention the work of my colleague, Professor Malfred Braut-Hagehammer, who looked into this question deeply about state capacity and its role in influencing nuclear programs, specifically in the Libyan case. So it's that discrepancy between having the resources, which is something that might be needed for a successful nuclear program, but not exclusively. You also need to have other stuff, including institutions, human capital, management of the program. Also, the Libyan case helps us perhaps also consider the challenges of having a dictator or a centralized government and what that means for nuclear programs. Because sometimes the impression is with more centralized power that you can have more successful nuclear programs. But in the case of Libya, you see a political leader that defines himself outside state structures, thinks of himself as a thinker rather than a statesperson, dabbles with ideas, but not really a manager, thinks of himself as a ruler, philosopher, rather than a political leader. And that style of leadership is one that is not very conducive to running big, technically demanding projects. It's not very good at building things. The other thing is obviously also state capacity. We've talked about institutions. And in the 70s, Libya started what it called the Cultural Revolution, modeled on the Chinese Revolution, but not exactly, like with some differences, where it dismantled state structures and started what is called ruling by popular committees. And what that did is that it further weakened state institutions that were already actually weak as a result of Libya's political history before Gaddafi. And that led to some challenges in terms of putting together good institutions and state capacity that can help nuclear programs to thrive.
Thank you for listening, our guests for speaking, and the European Union Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium for funding this series. Until next time, stay optimistic.